Captain Ibrahim Traoré launched a secret raid so dangerous, his own team wasn't told until wheels were moving. All it took was one encrypted call, 26 seconds of data that revealed a horror no leader should ever face. Over 800 people, infants, mothers, minors, children, were about to vanish. Hidden, harvested, sold. In the shadows of Ouagadougou, a trafficking empire worth $500 million was preparing its final shipment. Steel containers packed with sedated toddlers, women tagged like livestock, and bodies already priced by organ. And the worst part? Someone in the government knew. So Captain Traoré gave the command that changed everything. No phones. No files. We move now. What followed would stretch across deserts, data vaults, and diplomatic lines, an operation that began as a rescue, but became a reckoning. Because this was not about charity, not about pity, this was about dignity. Stay with us. Because what began with one man in the shadows of Ouagadougou may just rewrite Africa's fight for sovereignty. Subscribe, and do not look away. It began with a whisper through a secured line, coordinates, convoy movements, and one chilling phrase. You have 48 hours before they vanish. Captain Ibrahim Traoré didn't blink. He had seen maps like this before. But this time the dots weren't ink. They were blood. The intelligence painted a nightmare. A trafficking corridor stretching from the Sahel to the ports of Libya, steel containers rerouted through false NGO channels, armed guards posing as aid workers, routes once used for weapons now carrying children, women, and laborers, commodified, cataloged, moved like freight. From the outside, it looked like trade, but inside it was nothing less than slavery. That night, the capital's golden streetlights flickered against puddles of late rain. In a dim command room, red pins stabbed a military map tracing violence through Gao, Dori, and Saba. One location stood out, an abandoned warehouse 22 kilometers from the Mali border. Too isolated, too quiet. Yet satellite heat signatures revealed activity. Warm zones, irregular movement, no industrial machinery. Traoré stared at the map. His voice was calm but final. We go dark. Skeleton crew only. No phones. No leaks. No warning. At 0413, 5 armored vehicles rolled through scrubland under infrared silence. Traoré sat in the lead, eyes locked forward, one hand resting on his rifle. His mind, though, was with the girl mentioned in the file. Age 6, missing for 9 days, last tracked on the same corridor. The convoy halted. The warehouse loomed, 2 floors, corrugated steel, no signage. From the outside, it was just another forgotten storage site. But inside, too many heat pockets. Too tight. Too warm. Traoré raised his fist. The unit fanned out. 2 flanked right. 2 left. 1 held rear perimeter. They breached silently. No charges, just bolt cutters and breathless precision. Flashbangs muted. Doors cracked open. And there it was. Steel containers. 9 of them. Lined like tombs. A soft knock. Then another. A muffled cough. A child's cry. Over here, whispered an officer. Troops converged. Lock by lock. One hiss of the cutter at a time. The first container burst open, and the stench hit like a wound. Sweat. Blood, urine, plastic restraints. Inside, bodies folded into impossible positions. Women clutched infants. Boys no older than 7 stared blankly. A man lay unconscious, his hands tied behind his back. One girl had raw wounds around her ankles. They weren't passengers. They were inventory. Traoré stepped inside. The child closest to him reached up, eyes sunken, voice barely audible. Don't let them take me again. He knelt, nodded once. They won't. Units move fast. 9 containers. 172 human beings. Some too weak to stand. Others collapse the moment the doors open. Medics administered glucose, water, thermal blankets. A soldier whispered, they haven't seen sunlight in weeks. Then came the count. 49 children, 72 women, 51 men. Of the children, 19 were under the age of 5. This wasn't just trafficking. This was logistics, and it wasn't improvisation. It was infrastructure. One officer opened a storage room. Inside, export logs, false transit papers, medical intake forms, all printed, time-stamped, and bilingual, French and Arabic. On a crate, a shipping manifest stamped, "Relief Supplies, Tunisia." But the only relief here was that someone had come in time. International headlines would later describe the scene under Ibrahim Traoré news, but the images didn't do it justice. The smell, the silence, the fear. Traoré turned to his communications officer. "Evac ready? Helo inbound. ETA 15 minutes. We have 10." But fate would not wait. A crack. Sharp. Too close. Then the hiss of automatic gunfire. Bullets pinged off the steel containers like warning bells from hell. "Contact! Northeast wall." The raid was no longer quiet. But Traoré didn't flinch. "Hold perimeter. Push forward. Do not let them breach." His squad surged into fire. Because inside those containers, 172 lives were still breathing. And the men outside had come to silence them. Who warned the attackers? Who knew exactly when to strike? And why did they fight so desperately for human cargo already lost? The gunfire hadn't lasted long, but it had said enough. Whoever came to silence the rescue hadn't come to scare, they came to erase. 6 attackers, equipped with night sights and foreign gear, had chosen a window so narrow it could only mean one thing. Someone had tipped them off. Inside the warehouse, smoke still hung in the air. Medics worked between shadows, stabilizing dehydrated children, wrapping thermal blankets around bruised limbs, and whispering soft words in languages the children barely remembered. But outside, something colder was unfolding. One of the attackers had been captured alive. He wore no insignia, carried no ID, and refused to speak. But when they searched his vest, they found it. A compact, encrypted satellite terminal tucked beneath his side pouch. The brand? European. The chipset? Military grade. Traoré looked at it, then at his cyber team. "What can it do?" One analyst answered a broadcast. "Encrypt. And trigger a data purge." That word purge shifted the air in the room. A brown folder was dropped on the command table. "These files," said a junior officer, his voice barely steady, "contain everything. Site coordinates, chain of custody, even a partial ledger." His hand trembled as he opened the folder. Inside, transit logs stamped with official seals, donor compatibility charts, account routing numbers, and, most damning of all, a list of names, some circled in red. Some wore uniforms. Some had seats in government. The silence in the room turned suffocating. Traoré's eyes scanned the page. One name made his jaw tighten. A man he had once saluted. He turned to the group. "From now on, everything goes off-grid. No signals. No open comms. Lock the room. Lock the building. Anyone tries to leave, detain them." Orders flew like gunshots. Terminals were disconnected. Drives encrypted. Chain of custody protocols triggered. But the window was closing. The satellite terminal had already sent a signal, short, precise, and lethal. A backup protocol was being activated somewhere along the Sahel corridor. Data nodes were purging, logs vanishing, evidence evaporating into legal non-existence. But then hope. From the back of the room, a voice broke through. "I cloned the packets," said a young analyst. "We didn't stop the deletion, we mirrored it." Traoré turned sharply. "You have the logs?" The analyst nodded. "Complete transaction trail. Every buyer. Every route. Every offshore account." A new silence followed, this time not of fear, but of sheer disbelief. Among the mirrored files, one name appeared twice, underlined in red ink. Alumbra. Known only in fragments across 3 intelligence networks, the codename referred to a man called the Shadow Gatekeeper, alleged architect of the Trans-Sahel slave corridors. Fluent in 4 languages. Trained in Europe. Last seen in Madrid in 2018. Since then, vanished. Until now. The analyst pointed at the map. "We traced an active ping 70 kilometers east of Traoré. Abandoned phosphate site. 0 official activity for years. But the signal came from there." Traoré didn't hesitate. Prep air units. We move now. 3 hours later, a convoy moved under darkness. 2 helicopters hovered overhead, engines whispering through the Sahel dusk. In one vehicle, Traore sat motionless. His men had seen combat. They had seen betrayal. But what they were chasing now wasn't just a man. It was the key to names, to money, to the entire network. Then movement. 4 vehicles heading north, the pilot called in. One peeled left, one slowing. Classic misdirection. Traore didn't blink. Ignore the decoys. Stay on the lead. The chase surged. The fleeing convoy didn't scatter. They stayed too tight, too trained. It confirmed what Traore already knew. This wasn't a gang. It was a system. A well-placed round from one of Traore's vehicles cracked the lead convoy's tire. The truck veered, slammed into a boulder. Its door flew open. Out stepped a man in a dark jacket. Tall, calm, a briefcase in hand. No weapon. He looked Traore in the eye and smiled. "You're late," he said. "You're finished," Traore replied. Inside the briefcase, 2 drives, biometric locked. Labels, South Route, and Client Ledger. Names, codes, transfer orders, fingerprint verification. The man said nothing more. But when one drive pinged a server in Senegal, the analyst froze. Purge has started, 40% already lost. Traore turned to the gatekeeper. "Override it." The man smiled again. "You don't have the keys." But Traore's voice was steel. "We don't need keys. We have your fingers." And he meant it, because in the mobile command truck, the drives were already mirrored. The screen lit up with a blinking list of countries: Cyprus, Malta, Seychelles, Panama. Offshore trust after offshore trust. Over 30 million euros moved annually. Within 20 minutes, the data was cloned. Names were matched. Government IDs verified. The mirror was secured and sent to Ghana's cybercrime unit and Interpol simultaneously. When news broke, the first wave of public outrage came not from the streets, but from the silence breaking online. In WhatsApp groups from Ouagadougou to Accra, in mosques, churches, and market stalls, people whispered the same phrase. They caught the one who knew. Some cried, some shouted, but many just stared at their phones asking, how deep does this go? How many leaders shook this man's hand? How many lives were priced in boardrooms? By the end of the hour, #AfricaRise trended across the continent. Now that the architect had a face, would Africa have the courage to expose the rest of the blueprint? The sun rose slowly over the Sahel, but the truth had already broken faster than light. By 7 o'clock, triage tents had been erected around the warehouse site. Soldiers moved like surgeons, not warriors. Stretchers lined the sand. Medics rotated between collapsed bodies and silent children. Some victims had tracking implants embedded deep beneath their skin. Some still had fresh barcode tags stapled to their clothing. One woman, barely 20, was in early labor. A boy coughed blood from dehydration. A 6-year-old girl stared at nothing, gripping an empty plastic spoon like a weapon. The youngest, just 8 months old, was found with a cord tied to her ankle, labeled B2 Kaya/ready. This wasn't escape. This was extraction interrupted. They hadn't been rescued from danger. They had been recovered from delivery. By midday, the numbers became real. A total of 832 individuals were recovered across 5 sites. 427 children, 320 women, and 85 men. Of the children, more than 90 were under the age of 10. Many had been moved across at least 3 borders. Some had been transported 6 times in 1 month, Dori to Gao to Gat to Saba, then rerouted through non-existent aid routes across southern Tunisia. The men had been forced into illegal mining sites, some blind from exposure to mercury, others crippled from prolonged shackling. The women, especially those pregnant, had been kept on glucose IVs, their vitals recorded not for care, but for compatibility. The files found inside an abandoned clinic in Koudougou had columns labeled organ viability and shelf life 48H. No medical staff were found, only loaded syringes, some still warm. At the media holding area near Ouagadougou, the first detainees were led past reporters. No hoods, No gloves, just faces. Among them, a former deputy minister for trade, two intelligence officers from Burkina Faso's domestic counterterror unit, and a man recognized immediately by the international press, a former military advisor who once stood behind President Alassane Ouattara at a UN podium in Geneva. Now he stood cuffed and head down, flanked by the same soldiers who used to salute him. It was a spectacle, but one that trembled with consequence. Inside the presidential compound, the cabinet held an emergency session. Files were being pulled. Comms were going dark. A few phones had gone silent by force. Two ministers reportedly fled the country within hours, using diplomatic visas routed through private terminals at Bobo Dioulasso. At least one had been in touch with an NGO registered in Malta, later linked to shell companies inside the ledger marked South Route. This was no longer just an operation, it was exposure, a political X-ray. The people too felt it. Markets in Ouagadougou buzzed not with prices but with names. Mosques replaced morning sermons with updates. Pastors spoke of a nation cleansed by courage. Radios repeated the phrase, "They came for our children." But the children lived. Mothers wept. Fathers clenched fists. Some offered food to the soldiers without speaking. Others asked the same question again and again. How long had this been happening? How many were lost before this? But fear returned quickly. Not everyone celebrated. Rumors spread of a second convoy preparing to flee with classified documents. A local journalist received a photo of a black SUV spotted outside the home of a prominent general, burned to ash 2 hours later. The message was clear: this isn't over. Whispers of betrayal swirled through the ranks. Who knew? Who leaked? Who stayed silent because they feared they were next? The whispers were confirmed when a confidential alert leaked that same evening. An assassination plot against Captain Ibrahim Traoré had been detected. The plot, marked Class A, originated from a private military contracting group with links to former intelligence officers in Abidjan and Dakar. Codeword Casque Vert, status active. That night, Traoré's security protocol was elevated to wartime conditions. Perimeter rotations doubled. All food deliveries were intercepted. Internal communications were stripped to verbal relay. His circle reduced from 12 to 6. Every visitor scanned twice. No exception. International media began covering the story under a new headline: Tentative d'assassinat Ibrahim Traoré. But inside the country, that phrase wasn't seen as fear. It became proof. Proof that the storm was shaking the walls it was meant to. Proof that if someone wanted him gone, it meant he was finally hitting what they never thought would be touched. Across Burkina Faso, the atmosphere was electric. Not celebratory, but alert, vigilant, as if the whole country was holding its breath. Not just because of what had been discovered, but because of what still remained hidden. In Gawa, a group of young people spray-painted the word dignity on the side of an abandoned aid truck. In Kaya, elders gathered around radios and called it the return of the ancestors' will. In Bobo, a group of schoolgirls stood outside a former safe house with placards that read, "You did not steal our futures. You gave them back." But in the capital, power was panicking. Not because of the arrests, but because Captain Traoré hadn't stopped. He wasn't negotiating. He wasn't holding a press conference. He was moving. And everyone inside the system knew, when a soldier doesn't ask for permission, he isn't playing politics. He's taking it back. If even the bravest voices now need protection, how many truths are still buried under layers of silence? News of the raid spread faster than any press release. Before official statements were even prepared, the footage had already gone global. Children wrapped in foil blankets, soldiers emerging from steel containers, a man in handcuffs whose face had once stood behind African presidents at summits, now pushed into the back of a troop carrier. And at the center of it all, a single name: Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Within hours, the African Union convened an emergency committee, not just for condemnation, but for coordination. The AU Commission chair publicly backed the arrests, citing the Rome Statute and calling the operation a sovereign act of African jurisprudence. In private, several member states urged caution. This opens too many closets, one West African diplomat said anonymously. If Burkina can expose this, others will be expected to do the same. ECOWAS, still reeling from tensions over sanctions and military coups, issued a reserved but symbolic statement. We call for a regional task force to investigate transnational trafficking. Behind closed doors, however, their intelligence desks were scrambling. Files were being rechecked. Airport manifests reanalyzed. One internal ECOWAS cable, leaked days later, confirmed what many feared. The trafficking network had touched every major border, from Senegal to Niger, from coastal Benin to central Mali. The European Union, meanwhile, found itself in a diplomatic bind. Multiple components of the captured logistics, including fake NGO registrations, medical implants, and offshore banking nodes, had links to companies based in EU member states. Malta, Spain, Germany. The files captured during the raid included active transit numbers and customs codes passed as humanitarian cargo. We are investigating, said the EU External Action Service. But the phrasing felt distant, disembodied, almost rehearsed. In the United States, the tone was sharper. A State Department spokesperson said, "We commend efforts to dismantle human trafficking routes across the Sahel." But questions arose quickly about where U.S. satellite imagery, data analytics, and counterterrorism funding had been directed. One journalist asked on live broadcast, if this trafficking corridor was visible from Burkina, how did AFRICOM miss it? The silence was louder than the answer. But nowhere did the response feel more visceral than on the streets. From Nairobi to Dakar, from Bamako to Johannesburg. Across the continent, a single phrase trended on social media. Traore did what the world wouldn't. In WhatsApp groups, in churches, in crowded university halls, people debated not the legality, but the bravery. Not the politics, but the line that had finally been drawn. Then came the leak. A classified security memo, shared by a rogue agent, revealed a coordinated attempt on the life of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, originating from a private military contracting network with former ties to European advisors. The memo's title? Tentative d'assassinat Ibrahim Traoré. The revelation detonated across global newsrooms. This wasn't just blowback. This was retaliation. The kind that signals the operation had cut deeper than expected. That someone, somewhere, had lost more than money. They had lost control. For many Africans, the message was clear. The battle wasn't just in containers or bank vaults. It was now in courtrooms, in boardrooms, in press rooms. And Traoré, whether one agreed with his politics or not, had drawn a new kind of red line. One that said sovereignty includes the right to expose rot, even if that rot was hidden in suits and embassies. If the world now knows what was hidden, what will it choose to do with that knowledge? By the third morning, the world had changed, but the dust had not yet settled. The steel containers had been opened, the ledgers decrypted, and the children rescued. But the deeper war, the one fought in silence, was only beginning. Operation Falcon had struck at the bones of an invisible empire, but its remnants still ran through ports, policy, and profit. Now came the harder question, what next? For Captain Ibrahim Traoré, there was no ambiguity. In his words, delivered quietly to a closed military council, "This is not a battle to be won. It is a system to be dismantled." Those words reverberated far beyond that room. Because what had once been considered too dangerous to confront was now too dangerous to ignore. Across Burkina Faso, work began before dawn. Temporary shelters were expanded, psychologists flown in, food stocks redirected from military reserves. The children rescued weren't statistics, they were citizens. Their names were being restored to state registers, one by one. And with every fingerprint scanned, a declaration echoed beneath the surface. You were meant to belong, not be sold. But justice moved slower than rescue. Traoré's team had triggered over 50 cross-border investigations, bank accounts frozen, customs logs reanalyzed, diplomatic immunity challenged, and every step drew new threats. Yet something had shifted. The silence no longer belonged to the traffickers. It belonged to those who had looked the other way. In Niamey, a regional summit was scheduled, its sole agenda, sovereignty against exploitation. In Addis Ababa, the African Union announced a tribunal proposal for transnational crimes against humanity with jurisdiction across borders. For the first time, African leaders were preparing to prosecute on African soil with African prosecutors and African evidence. The world watched closely. But within Burkina Faso, the atmosphere remained razor-tight. Security remained under martial protocols. Investigations reached into telecom companies, customs officials, even within national intelligence. Trust had become a luxury. Traore moved with a smaller team now, not because of fear, but clarity. When systems fail, he said, you rebuild with the hands that bled, not the ones that signed away our children. Those words struck like scripture. In schools, teachers read them aloud. In mosques and churches, they echoed between prayers. Something was being reclaimed, not just sovereignty, but narrative. And yet the path ahead was steep. The trafficking networks had not disappeared. Their roots had been exposed, but not all dismantled. Foreign actors were still watching, some plotting retaliation, others redrawing maps of influence. What Traore had done was light a beacon. Whether it became a signal of uprising or a target for erasure remained to be seen. But for the first time, people were watching not with fear, but with belief. That perhaps if one small landlocked nation could rise, then the rest of the continent could too. This was no longer just about Burkina Faso. This was about the very soil of Africa saying, not our children, not our silence, not again. Can a continent still heal when the scars are carved by its own institutions and the cure demands a revolution of dignity? This was never just about a raid, not just about a convoy, not even about the children found in silence. This was about something deeper, about a land that refused to forget its worth, about a leader who saw dignity not as decoration, but as duty. In the space of 48 hours, Captain Ibrahim Traoré transformed what many had dismissed as whispers into a reckoning. He exposed a system where flesh became currency, where silence was sold at auction, and where even hope had a price tag. But more than exposure, he offered something rarer, proof that resistance is not fiction, that sovereignty is not a slogan, that a nation, even under siege, can still stand tall. Across the globe, the headline Ibrahim Traoré News no longer sat on page 12, it led the front. Not because he asked for fame, but because he forced the world to look where it had long chosen to blink. And when the attempt to erase him surfaced, the tentative d'assassinat Ibrahim Traoré, it did not break the movement. It confirmed its necessity. Because what kind of world demands the death of a man simply for saving life? What does that say about the world we've accepted? And yet, this is not where the story ends. The children are not statistics. They are songs yet to be sung, futures yet to unfold. The evidence is not just for courtrooms, it is for classrooms, for constitutions, for conversations between generations. We are not just witnesses. We are the next authors. Ibrahim Traoré News is more than trending, it is a test of whether we will archive this story in silence or echo it into a movement that spans not just borders, but beliefs. So, we leave you with this. If one small landlocked nation could dismantle a shadow empire in 48 hours, what stops the rest of us? What will you do with the truth now in your hands? If this story stirred even a flicker of fire in you, don't let it die. Share it. Subscribe. Add your voice to the chorus rising across this continent. Dignity is not a gift. It is a right. And today we claim it.